Hi, I'm Chloe Martinez, and 3 months ago I woke up in a king-sized bed wearing a designer wedding dress I'd never seen before, with a platinum ring on my finger and legal documents on the nightstand proving I was married to a man I'd met exactly twice in my life. My sister Victoria had spiked my champagne at her own engagement party, and somehow I'd become the bride instead of her. But what Victoria didn't know was that her perfect plan to marry into billions had one fatal flaw: she'd underestimated exactly how far the Hayes family would go to protect their empire, and she definitely underestimated me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows felt like needles against my skull. I remember blinking slowly, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar ceiling above me, the silk sheets beneath my skin, and the overwhelming scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. My mouth tasted like cotton mixed with something bitter and metallic, and when I tried to sit up, the room spun like I was still drunk, though I couldn't remember drinking anything stronger than champagne the night before. That's when I saw the dress. Hanging on a mahogany armoire across the room was the most beautiful wedding gown I'd ever laid eyes on, ivory silk with delicate pearl beading that caught the Colorado sunlight streaming through the windows. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked down at myself, still wearing what appeared to be an expensive slip dress I didn't recognize, and then I saw it. The ring. A massive diamond solitaire surrounded by smaller stones, sitting heavy and foreign on my left ring finger. Like it had grown there overnight. I stumbled toward the nightstand, my legs unsteady beneath me, and that's when I saw the papers. Marriage certificate. State of Colorado. Bride, Chloe Elena Martinez. Groom, Alexander James Hayes. Date, yesterday. My hands trembled as I read the signatures, my own handwriting staring back at me in black ink, though I had absolutely no memory of signing anything. Alexander Hayes. The name echoed in my foggy mind until the pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Victoria's fiancé's father. The billionaire tech mogul who owned half of Denver's skyline and had barely acknowledged my existence during the 2 family dinners we'd shared. The bedroom door opened with a soft click, and Alexander Hayes himself walked in carrying a silver tray with coffee and what looked like medication. He was exactly as I remembered him, tall, distinguished, with silver hair that probably cost more to maintain than my monthly rent, wearing a crisp white dress shirt and dark slacks like he'd already been up for hours conducting business. His blue eyes met mine with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between concern and calculation. "You're awake," he said, setting the tray on a small table near the window. His voice was deep, controlled, the kind of voice that commanded boardrooms and probably governments. "How are you feeling?" I stared at him, my throat dry as sandpaper. "What happened? Where am I? What is this?" I held up my hand, the ring catching the light like an accusation. Alexander moved closer, but not close enough to crowd me, his movements careful and deliberate. "You're at my estate in Aspen. As for what happened, I was hoping you could tell me. Do you remember anything from last night?" The question hit me like a slap. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to force my brain to work through the fog. Victoria's engagement party. The Riverside Hotel's grand ballroom decorated in white and gold, hundreds of guests in cocktail attire, champagne flowing like water. I remembered toasting my sister, remembered Brandon Hayes looking nervous in his tuxedo, remembered feeling genuinely happy for Victoria despite our complicated history. But after that, everything became fragments. Flashes of images that didn't make sense. A car ride. Bright lights. Someone's hands guiding me somewhere. A man's voice saying, "I do," and my own voice responding, though it sounded like it was coming from underwater. "I remember the party," I said slowly, sinking onto the edge of the bed. Victoria looked beautiful. Everyone was celebrating. I had champagne, maybe 2 glasses, but I'm not a lightweight. I should remember more than this. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Chloe, I need you to think carefully. Who gave you those drinks? Did anyone approach you, anyone you didn't know well?" The question sent ice through my veins because suddenly I did remember something. Victoria bringing me a fresh glass of champagne, her smile a little too bright, her insistence that I try the special reserve they'd ordered just for the family. "You deserve to celebrate too, Chloe," she'd said, pressing the crystal flute into my hands. "You've been such an amazing sister through all of this." I'd been touched by the gesture, especially since Victoria and I had been distant for years. Ever since she'd started dating Brandon and gotten swept up in the Hayes family's world of private jets and charity galas. "My sister," I whispered, the words tasting like poison. Victoria gave me the champagne. But she couldn't have. But even as I said it, doubt crept in. Victoria had always been ambitious, always been the type to see people as stepping stones rather than individuals. Our parents had spoiled her relentlessly, funding her expensive tastes and never questioning her methods of getting what she wanted. When she'd started dating Brandon Hayes 6 months ago, she'd transformed overnight from a struggling interior designer into someone who spoke casually about European vacations and designer handbags. Alexander sat down in the chair across from me, his expression grave. Chloe, there's something you need to know about last night, about why we're here, about why you're wearing that ring. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Your sister didn't just drug your drink. She had this planned. The whole thing was orchestrated, but not the way she intended. My blood turned to ice water. What are you talking about? Victoria thought she was being clever. She discovered some information about my business dealings, something she could use as leverage to force a quickie engagement with Brandon. She planned to drug your drink to incapacitate you, keep you out of the way while she cornered me into agreeing to an immediate wedding. She thought holding something over my head would guarantee her the Hayes fortune. I felt sick, but I forced myself to keep listening. What she didn't know, Alexander continued, is that I've been investigating her for weeks. My security team discovered she'd been selling information about our family to competitors, using her access to Brandon to gather intelligence on my business. When she approached me last night with her little blackmail scheme, I was ready for her. So why am I wearing a wedding dress? Why am I married to you instead of her being married to Brandon? Alexander's smile was razor sharp. Because Victoria made one crucial mistake. She assumed I'd be desperate enough to let her extort me. Instead, I let her execute her plan exactly as she designed it, with one small modification. When she handed you that drugged champagne, my people switched the glasses. Victoria ended up drinking her own concoction while you got the antidote we'd prepared. When she passed out in the bathroom 20 minutes later, we made sure she stayed unconscious. Long enough for us to execute our own plan. The room was spinning again, but this time it wasn't from drugs. Your own plan? Victoria wanted to marry into the Hayes family to get access to our money and our secrets. I needed a wife for tax and inheritance purposes, someone I could trust. Not to betray me the way she planned to betray Brandon. When she tried to blackmail me last night, she inadvertently provided the perfect solution. You were already dressed appropriately for a wedding, already at the venue, and already the victim of her scheme. All we had to do was take you to our private chapel and complete the ceremony while she was indisposed. I stood up abruptly, my head spinning with rage and disbelief. You married me without my consent. You drugged me too. Actually, no. Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a small recording device. You gave your consent. Repeatedly. The antidote we gave you counteracted your sister's drugs, but it also acted as a mild truth serum. When our officiant asked if you wanted to marry me to prevent Victoria from destroying both our families, you said yes. When he asked if you understood the terms of our prenuptial agreement, you said yes. When he asked if you were acting of your own free will, you said yes. He pressed play, and my own voice filled the room, slurred but unmistakably mine, agreeing to everything he'd just described. The walls felt like they were closing in. I was married to a man I barely knew, a man who'd orchestrated an elaborate scheme using me as a pawn against my own sister. But even as panic clawed at my chest, another part of my mind was working, analyzing, trying to understand the full scope of what had happened. Where's Victoria now? I asked. In police custody. When she woke up this morning, she found herself charged with attempted drugging, conspiracy to commit fraud, and corporate espionage. The evidence was overwhelming. Text messages, recorded conversations, financial records showing payments from my competitors. She's looking at serious prison time. I sank back onto the bed, overwhelmed. My sister had tried to drug me to further her own schemes, but instead had ended up drugged herself. I'd been married off to a billionaire who'd used me to trap her. None of it felt real. What happens now? I whispered. Alexander's expression softened slightly. Now, we figure out how to move forward. I know this isn't what you planned for. Your life, Chloe. But Victoria forced both of our hands. She was going to destroy my family and yours in pursuit of money and status. This was the only way to stop her while protecting everyone else. Everyone else? What about me? What about what I want? For the first time since I'd woken up, Alexander looked genuinely remorseful. You're right. You didn't choose this, and you shouldn't have to live with the consequences of Victoria's actions. That's why I had my lawyers draft papers giving you complete control over your own life going forward. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You can get an annulment tomorrow if that's what you want. You'll keep the ring and receive a settlement that will set you up for life. Or what? Or we make this work. Not as a real marriage, not immediately, but as a partnership. You help me clean up the mess Victoria created, and I help you build whatever life you want for yourself. No pressure, no expectations beyond mutual respect and honesty. I stared at him, trying to read the man behind the calculated exterior. Alexander Hayes was known for being ruthless in business, but he'd also built his empire on the principle of keeping his word. If he was offering me a way out, he meant it. But if he was offering me a partnership, that meant something too. I need time to think, I said finally. Of course. Take all the time you need. There's clothing in the closet that should fit you, and my assistant Jonathan will be available if you need anything. The estate is secure, so you're safe here while you decide what you want to do next. After Alexander left, I walked to the window and looked out at the sprawling mountain landscape. Somewhere down in Denver, Victoria was probably sitting in a jail cell, finally facing consequences for her actions. Somewhere else, Brandon was probably waking up to discover his fiancé was a criminal and his father was married to her sister. And here I was, legally bound to a man I'd never chosen, holding the power to walk away from it all or dive deeper into a world I'd never imagined entering. But as I stood there, still wearing Alexander's ring, one thought kept echoing in my mind. Victoria had underestimated me her entire life, dismissed me as the quiet, boring sister who'd never amount to anything. She'd tried to use me as a disposable tool in her scheme to marry into wealth and power. What she hadn't considered was that maybe, just maybe, I was exactly the kind of person who could handle that wealth and power better than she ever could. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I spent the next hour exploring the bedroom suite, trying to piece together the fragments of memory that were slowly returning. The clothing Alexander had mentioned was indeed in the walk-in closet, an entire wardrobe in my exact size ranging from casual wear to business attire to evening gowns. Someone had done their homework, which meant this hadn't been a completely spontaneous decision on Alexander's part. He'd been planning something, though whether it had originally involved me or Victoria, I couldn't be sure. The bathroom was larger than my entire apartment back in Denver, with a soaking tub that could fit 3 people and a shower with more buttons and settings than a spaceship. I ran a hot bath and sank into the water, letting the heat work out the tension in my muscles while I tried to think through my situation rationally. Victoria had always been the golden child, the one our parents believed would marry well and live the life they'd dreamed of for their daughters. I'd been the practical one, the one who'd put myself through college working double shifts at a campus coffee shop, the one who'd chosen a career in social work because I wanted to help people rather than make money. Our parents had always made it clear which approach they preferred, which daughter they saw as successful. But now Victoria was in jail, and I was married to one of the most powerful men in Colorado. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so terrifying. A soft knock on the bedroom door interrupted my thoughts. I climbed out of the tub, wrapped myself in a plush robe, and opened the door to find a young man in a crisp suit holding a silver tray. Mrs. Hayes? I'm Jonathan Reed, Mr. Hayes' assistant. I brought you some lunch and thought you might want to see these. He set the tray on the table and handed me a tablet computer. These are news reports from this morning. I took the tablet with trembling fingers and began to read. The headlines were brutal. Billionaire's son's fiancé arrested for corporate espionage. Hayes family wedding scandal rocks Denver society. Victoria Martinez charged with multiple felonies day after engagement party. But it was the details in the articles that made my stomach drop. Victoria hadn't just been selling information to competitors. She'd been systematically photographing confidential documents during her visits to Brandon's apartment, copying his laptop files, even recording private family conversations. The evidence was overwhelming and apparently had been building for months. How long has Mr. Hayes known about this? I asked Jonathan. Mr. Hayes received the first report about suspicious activity 6 weeks ago, Jonathan replied carefully. The investigation confirmed his suspicions 3 weeks ago. He's been working with federal authorities to build a case ever since. 3 weeks ago. That meant Alexander had known exactly what Victoria was planning when she approached him with her blackmail scheme. He'd been ready for her, prepared to turn her own plan against her. Which raised the question of why he'd chosen to marry me instead of simply having her arrested immediately. Jonathan, can I ask you something? Of course, Mrs. Hayes. Why? Me? Why didn't Mr. Hayes just have Victoria arrested without involving me at all? Jonathan's expression became carefully neutral. I think that's a question you'd need to ask Mr. Hayes directly, ma'am. But if I may say so, he spoke very highly of you after the family dinners you attended. He was impressed by your work with underprivileged children and your dedication to your principles. After Jonathan left, I sat with the tablet and continued reading. The more I learned about Victoria's crimes, the angrier I became. She hadn't just betrayed the Hayes family, she'd betrayed everyone who'd trusted her. Our parents, who'd loaned her money for her business ventures. Brandon, who genuinely loved her and planned to propose. Even me, her own sister, who she'd been willing to drug and incapacitate to further her schemes. By the time evening arrived, I'd made my decision. When Alexander knocked on my door, I was ready for him. "I've been thinking about your offer," I said, still wearing the comfortable jeans and sweater I'd found in the closet. "I have some conditions." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "First, I want complete transparency. No more secrets, no more schemes. If we're going to be partners in this, I need to know everything." "Agreed." "Second, I want to maintain my own career and my own life. I'm not going to become some trophy wife who spends her days shopping and getting her nails done. I wouldn't expect you to. Third, I want to use whatever resources come with being your wife to actually help people. I've seen what money can do when it's used selfishly. I want to use it differently." Alexander smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "I think we can work with that. Anything else?" "Yes. I want to know why you really chose me. And don't tell me it was just convenience. You could have had Victoria arrested without marrying anyone." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. "You really want the truth?" "I really want the truth. I've been watching you, Chloe." Not in a creepy way, he added quickly, "but whenever you came to family dinners, whenever Victoria mentioned you, I paid attention. You're everything she isn't. You're genuine, you're principled, you care about people more than things." When I realized Victoria was going to force my hand with her blackmail scheme, I started thinking about what I actually wanted out of a marriage. Even a marriage of convenience. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I'm 52 years old. I've built an empire, but I've never built a legacy that means anything beyond money. You have a master's degree in social work experience, with nonprofit management, and a passion for helping people that Victoria could never fake. If I'm going to be married, I want it to be to someone who can help me do something meaningful with my wealth. And if I want out? If I decide this is too much? Then you walk away with enough money to fund any project you want for the rest of your life, and I'll respect your decision completely." I studied his face, looking for signs of deception, but found none. Alexander Hayes might be calculating and strategic, but he seemed to be offering me something real. A chance to turn Victoria's betrayal into something positive, to use the power and resources she'd tried to steal for the purposes she'd never understand. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's try this partnership. But I have one more condition." "What's that?" "I want to visit Victoria. I want to hear her side of the story before I commit to anything permanently." Alexander's expression darkened slightly. "Are you sure that's wise? She's going to try to manipulate you, to make you feel guilty for her choices. Maybe. But she's still my sister, and I need to understand how we got here before I can decide where we're going." Alexander nodded slowly. "I'll arrange it. But Chloe, I want you to be prepared for the fact that the Victoria you're going to see might not be the sister you remember. Desperation and anger can change people in ways you don't expect." "I know. But I need to try." As Alexander left that night, I stood again at the window, looking out at the lights of Aspen twinkling in the darkness. Tomorrow I would visit my sister in jail and learn exactly how far she'd fallen. Tomorrow I would start figuring out what it meant to be married to a man I barely knew but was beginning to respect. Tomorrow I would begin the process of turning the worst day of my life into the first day of something entirely new. But tonight, I was going to call my parents and tell them their golden daughter was in jail and their disappointment of a daughter was now married to a billionaire. I had a feeling that conversation was going to be almost as interesting as everything else that had happened in the past 24 hours. The phone rang 3 times before my mother's voice answered, bright and cheerful as always. "Chloe, sweetheart. How are you feeling? You left Victoria's party so early last night, we were worried you might be coming down with something." I took a deep breath, still staring out at the mountain landscape that was apparently now my home. "Mom, we need to talk." The Denver County Jail smelled like disinfectant and defeat. I sat in the visitor's room, my hands folded tightly in my lap, watching other families conduct hushed conversations through reinforced glass partitions. Alexander had offered to accompany me, but I declined. This conversation with Victoria needed to happen without the man who'd orchestrated her downfall sitting beside me like a silent reminder of how completely her world had collapsed. When the guard brought Victoria out, I barely recognized her. Gone was the perfectly styled hair, the designer makeup, the confident posture that had defined my sister for as long as I could remember. In their place was a woman in an orange jumpsuit with hollow eyes and unwashed hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked like she'd aged 5 years in the 3 days since her arrest. Victoria picked up the phone on her side of the glass partition, and I mirrored the action. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stared at each other through the scratched plexiglass that now separated our worlds permanently. So, Victoria finally said, her voice hoarse and bitter. "How's married life treating you, Mrs. Hayes?" The venom in her tone caught me off guard, even though I'd expected anger. "Victoria, I didn't know what was happening. I didn't choose any of this." "Didn't you?" Victoria leaned forward, her eyes flashing with the kind of rage I'd never seen from her before. "You always resented me, Chloe. Always hated that I was the one who could make something of herself while you wallowed in your little social worker fantasy, pretending to care about people who couldn't do anything for you in return." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "That's not fair, and you know it. I never resented your success. I resented the way you stepped on people to get it." "Oh, please." Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You're sitting there wearing clothes that probably cost more than you made in 6 months, married to a man worth more than most small countries, and you want to lecture me about stepping on people? You landed the biggest prize of all, and you didn't even have to work for it. I landed it because you drugged me and tried to blackmail my husband." "Your husband?" Victoria shook her head slowly. "Do you even hear yourself? 3 days ago, you were living in that pathetic studio apartment, driving a car held together with duct tape and hope, working for peanuts at a job that would never amount to anything. Now you're defending the man who destroyed my life like he's some kind of hero." I studied my sister's face, searching for any trace of the woman who'd hugged me at family dinners, who'd sent me birthday cards with handwritten notes, who'd called me crying when our grandmother died. That woman seemed to have vanished completely, replaced by someone consumed with bitterness and self-pity. "Victoria, why did you do it? The espionage, the blackmail, the drugging. Why risk everything for money you didn't even need? Brandon loved you. You could have had a good life with him without all the scheming." Victoria's expression twisted into something ugly. "A good life? Chloe, Brandon's trust fund wouldn't have lasted 5 years at the rate I needed to live. His father kept him on an allowance like he was still in college. Do you know what it's like to have access to billions of dollars but not be able to touch any of it? To have to ask permission to buy a purse or take a vacation? So you decided to steal it instead?" "I decided to take what should have been mine by right." Victoria's voice rose, drawing glances from other visitors. She lowered it again, but the intensity remained. "I was going to be part of that family, Chloe. I deserved to benefit from their wealth. All I was doing was securing my future." "By selling their secrets to competitors? By betraying people who trusted you? By being smart enough to create leverage?" Victoria leaned back in her chair, some of her old confidence returning. "Alexander Hayes didn't build his empire by being nice, Chloe. He crushed competitors, bought out rivals, manipulated markets. The only difference between what he did and what I did is that he won." I stared at my sister, finally understanding the depth of her delusion. In her mind, she wasn't a criminal who'd betrayed the people closest to her. She was a victim of circumstance, a player in a game who'd simply been outmaneuvered by someone more ruthless. The Victoria I'd grown up with, the sister I'd loved despite her flaws, had been consumed entirely by greed and entitlement. "What about me?" I asked quietly. "What about what you did to me specifically? You drugged me, Victoria. You were willing to incapacitate your own sister to further your schemes." For the first time since she'd sat down, Victoria's mask slipped slightly. I saw a flicker of something that might have been shame before she hardened her expression again. "You weren't supposed to get hurt. You were just supposed to sleep through the important parts." "The important parts of what? Your blackmail attempt?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. When she looked up again, her eyes held a calculating gleam that made my skin crawl. "I found something, Chloe. Something that could have brought down the entire Hayes empire. Alexander's been hiding assets offshore, manipulating tax records, bribing government officials. I had evidence of everything." My blood chilled. "You're lying." "Am I? Why do you think? He was so eager to marry you instead of just having me arrested?" "A wife can't be compelled to testify against her husband, Chloe. You're not his partner, you're his insurance policy." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on the romantic notion of partnership, of using wealth for good, that I hadn't considered the legal implications of our marriage. A wife couldn't be forced to testify against her husband in criminal proceedings. If Victoria was telling the truth about Alexander's crimes, then my marriage wasn't about respect or shared values. It was about protection from prosecution. "You're just trying to manipulate me," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Victoria smiled, and for a moment she looked like her old self again, confident and in control. "Think about it, Chloe. A man with Alexander's resources and connections doesn't need to trick some random social worker into marriage for companionship. He could have any woman he wanted. But how many of those women would be naive enough to believe his story about partnership and shared goals? How many would be desperate enough for validation to go along with a sham marriage without asking too many questions? I stood up abruptly, the plastic chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Other visitors turned to look, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, replaying every conversation I'd had with Alexander, every gesture and expression, looking for signs of deception I might have missed. "Where is this evidence?" I asked through gritted teeth. "Safe," Victoria replied. "Hidden. Where only I can find it." "And Chloe? If anything happens to me in here, if I have any kind of accident or sudden illness, that evidence goes straight to the FBI. So your new husband better make sure I stay healthy." I hung up the phone without saying goodbye and walked out of the visiting room on unsteady legs. The guard at the exit asked if I was okay, and I managed to nod and keep walking until I reached Alexander's car in the parking lot. Jonathan was waiting behind the wheel, and he took one look at my face before handing me a bottle of water and starting the engine without a word. During the drive back to Aspen, I stared out the window at the Colorado landscape and tried to process what Victoria had told me. Was she lying, trying to manipulate me into helping her escape the consequences of her actions? Or was she telling the truth about Alexander's crimes, about my role as an unwitting accomplice in his legal protection strategy? By the time we reached the estate, I'd made a decision. If Alexander wanted a partnership based on honesty and transparency, then it was time to test that commitment. I was going to ask him directly about Victoria's allegations, and his answer would determine whether I stayed or walked away with whatever settlement he'd promised. I found Alexander in his study, a room I hadn't seen before that felt like the heart of his empire. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes on business, law, and philosophy. The 4th wall was dominated by windows overlooking the mountains, and Alexander's desk sat positioned to take advantage of the view. He was on the phone when I entered, speaking in rapid-fire sentences about market positions and acquisition targets. When he saw me, he concluded his call quickly and gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. "How did it go with Victoria?" "She told me some interesting things about you," I said without preamble. "About offshore accounts and bribery and tax evasion. She claims to have evidence that could destroy you, and she thinks the only reason you married me is to prevent me from testifying against you." Alexander's expression didn't change, but I caught a subtle tension in his shoulders. "And what do you think?" "I think I need to hear the truth from you before I decide whether to stay or go." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying me with those calculating blue eyes. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of an antique clock on the mantel. Finally, he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. "You want transparency? Here it is." He slid the folder across the desk toward me. "Everything Victoria thinks she has on me, along with the context she conveniently left out." I opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were photocopies of documents, financial records, email exchanges, and what appeared to be surveillance photos. The first section was labeled Offshore Holdings, and contained records of bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Luxembourg. "Yes, I have offshore accounts," Alexander said as I read. "They're all declared to the IRS, all legal, all part of a tax strategy developed by the best attorneys money can buy. Nothing hidden, nothing illegal." The next section contained records of political donations and lobbying expenses. Large sums paid to various politicians and advocacy groups, all properly documented and reported. "Bribing government officials," Alexander continued, "or as it's known in the real world, legal lobbying and campaign contributions. Every dollar accounted for, every interaction recorded and reported according to federal law." The final section was the most damning, containing what appeared to be evidence of market manipulation and insider trading. But as I read more carefully, I realized these were records of Alexander's compliance with SEC regulations, documentation showing how he'd avoided conflicts of interest and reported all relevant transactions. Victoria photographed the first page of each document, Alexander explained. "The pages that, taken out of context, could look incriminating to someone who doesn't understand corporate law." She missed the second and third pages that provide the legal framework and compliance documentation. I closed the folder and looked up at him. So she was lying? She was telling a version of the truth that supported her narrative. Victoria always was good at that, even as a child. Brandon told me stories about how she could twist any situation to make herself look like the victim. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anger at myself for doubting Alexander and anger at Victoria for trying to manipulate me even from jail. But one question still nagged at me. If this is all legitimate, why marry me at all? Why not just have Victoria arrested without complicating things with a sham marriage? Alexander was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than I'd heard it before. Because it's not a sham marriage, Chloe. Not for me. I stared at him, confused. What do you mean? I mean that marrying you wasn't just a convenient solution to Victoria's blackmail attempt. It was something I'd been thinking about since the first time I met you. Alexander stood and walked to the window, his back to me. Do you remember what you said at that first family dinner? Brandon asked you what you'd do if you had unlimited resources, and you didn't hesitate. You said you'd build affordable housing for families transitioning out of homelessness, fund mental health programs for at-risk youth, create job training programs for people with criminal records trying to rebuild their lives. I did remember that conversation. Victoria had rolled her eyes at my answers, clearly bored by talk that didn't involve luxury or status. Brandon had seemed genuinely interested, but in the abstract way of someone who'd never actually encountered the problems I dealt with daily. But Alexander had asked follow-up questions, probing for details about implementation and sustainability. Most people, when asked that question, talk about travel or cars or houses, Alexander continued. You talked about systemic change. You understood that money is just a tool, and the question isn't how much you have, it's what you build with it. He turned back to face me, and I was surprised to see vulnerability in his expression. I've spent 30 years building wealth, Chloe. I'm very good at it. But I've never been good at building meaning. When Victoria tried to blackmail me, when she forced a situation where I needed to make a quick decision about marriage, you were the obvious choice. Not because I needed a wife to avoid prosecution, but because I needed a partner who could help me figure out what to do with everything I'd built. And you thought I'd just go along with being married off like property? I thought you'd be angry, and rightfully so. I thought you'd demand explanations and impose conditions and probably walk away anyway. But I hoped that maybe, once you understood the full situation, you might see the opportunity in it. Not just the money, but the chance to accomplish things you've never been able to accomplish working within traditional systems. I stood and walked to the window beside him, looking out at the sprawling estate that was apparently now my home. You're asking me to build a life with someone I barely know, based on the promise of being able to help people with your money. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that we could build something together that's bigger than either of us could create alone. Alexander turned to face me fully. But if that's not what you want, if you'd rather take the settlement and walk away, I'll respect that decision. The choice is entirely yours. Standing there in that study, surrounded by the symbols of Alexander's empire, I thought about my life before Victoria's engagement party. My tiny apartment with its leaky faucet and unreliable heat. My job at the community center, where I spent most of my time fighting for funding to keep programs running. The constant frustration of seeing problems I knew how to solve but lacking the resources to implement solutions. Then I thought about Victoria, sitting in her jail cell, consumed by bitterness and self-pity because she'd lost access to wealth she'd never earned. She'd had every advantage, every opportunity, and she'd thrown it all away because she couldn't distinguish between having money and having worth. I need to see something, I said suddenly. Alexander raised an eyebrow. What? Your other properties? Your businesses? The full scope of what you're offering to share. If we're going to be partners, I need to understand exactly what I'm partnering with. A slow smile spread across Alexander's face. How much time do you have? All the time in the world, apparently. Over the next week, Alexander took me on what he called the Empire Tour. We flew on his private jet to properties in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and Seattle. I saw office buildings that housed hundreds of businesses, residential developments that provided affordable housing to thousands of families, technology companies that were developing solutions to environmental problems. But it was the smaller investments that impressed me most. A chain of community centers in low-income neighborhoods. A scholarship program that had sent over 1,000 first-generation college students to universities across the country. A network of mental health clinics that provided free services to anyone who needed them. I started these programs years ago, Alexander explained as we toured a clinic in Seattle that provided therapy services to homeless veterans. But I've never known how to scale them effectively. I understand business and finance, but I don't understand social work the way you do. I watched him interact with the clinic staff and the clients they served. He wasn't performative about it, wasn't playing the role of benevolent billionaire for my benefit. He genuinely listened when people talked about their challenges and took notes when they suggested improvements. This wasn't charity for him, it was investment in solutions. On our last stop, a job training center in Chicago that taught coding skills to people with criminal records, I met Maria Santos, a woman about my age who'd graduated from the program 6 months earlier and was now working as a software developer for a tech startup. Mr. Hayes saved my life, Maria told me over coffee in the center's break room. Not with handouts or pity, but with opportunity. This program gave me skills and connections I never could have gotten on my own. How many people have gone through the program? I asked. Over 3,000 in the past 5 years, Maria replied. And the success rate is incredible. 90% of graduates find employment within 6 months, and the recidivism rate is almost zero. Later, on the flight back to Denver, I sat across from Alexander in the jet's main cabin and finally understood what he'd been trying to show me. This wasn't about charity or guilt or tax write-offs. It was about systematic change, about using wealth as a tool to address root causes rather than just symptoms. Why haven't you expanded these programs? I asked. Because I don't know how to maintain quality while scaling quantity, Alexander replied honestly. Every time I've tried to grow too fast, the programs lose effectiveness. I need someone who understands both the business side and the human services side. Someone like me. Someone exactly like you. I stared out the window at the lights of Denver growing larger as we approached the airport. In the span of a week, my understanding of both Alexander and my situation had shifted completely. This wasn't a convenient marriage or a protection scheme. It was a genuine partnership opportunity with someone who'd spent years building the infrastructure for the kind of work I'd always dreamed of doing. But one thing still bothered me, one conversation I needed to have before I could fully commit to this new life. I want to see Victoria again, I said. Alexander's expression tightened. Why? Because I need to tell her what I've decided. And because, despite everything she's done, she's still my sister. I need to try one more time. To reach the person she used to be. Chloe, the person she used to be might never have existed in the first place. Sometimes people show us what we want to see until they don't need to anymore. Maybe. But I have to try. Alexander nodded slowly. Then we'll go together this time. If you're going to face her as my wife and my partner, you shouldn't have to do it alone. 2 days later, we sat together in the Denver County Jail visitors room, waiting for Victoria to be brought out. I'd worn one of the business suits from the wardrobe Alexander had provided, and I'd deliberately chosen to wear the wedding ring that I'd been taking on and off since our marriage. Today, I wanted Victoria to see exactly who I'd become. When Victoria appeared, she looked even worse than she had during my first visit. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on her frame, suggesting she'd lost weight, and her eyes had the hollow, desperate look of someone who was finally beginning to understand the full consequences of her actions. She picked up the phone on her side of the partition, and I noticed her gaze immediately focus on the ring on my left hand. For a moment, something that might have been regret flashed across her face before being replaced by familiar anger. So you've decided to play house with your billionaire husband, Victoria said. How adorable. I've decided to build something meaningful with the resources available to me, I replied calmly. Something you never understood how to do. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Don't lecture me from your ivory tower, Chloe. A week ago you were nobody. Now you think you're better than me because you got lucky? I think I'm different from you because I understand the difference between having wealth and being worth something. I leaned forward, making sure Victoria could see the certainty in my eyes. You had every opportunity to build a real relationship with Brandon, to contribute something positive to his family, to use your access to their resources for good. Instead, you chose to steal and betray and manipulate. I chose to secure my future. You chose to destroy it. I stood up, Alexander rising beside me. Your arraignment is next week, Victoria. Your lawyer says you're looking at 10 to 15 years if you're convicted on all charges. But Alexander has offered to speak with the prosecutor about a plea deal if you're willing to cooperate fully with their investigation. Victoria's expression shifted, hope and calculation warring across her features. What kind of plea deal? 5 years, eligible for parole in 3. You'd have to provide all the evidence you gathered, testify against the competitors who were buying information from you, and agree to counseling and restitution payments. And what do you get out of it? I studied my sister's face, looking for any trace of genuine remorse or understanding. All I saw was the same selfish calculation that had driven her to this point. I get to know that I tried to help you, even after everything you did. I picked up the phone one last time. This is the last offer, Victoria. Take it or don't, but don't expect me to visit you again. I have a life to build, and I'm not going to let your choices hold me back anymore. Victoria stared at me through the scratched plexiglass, and for just a moment, I saw something in her eyes that looked like the sister I'd grown up loving. Chloe, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did to you, for how I treated you, for all of it. I know you are, I said softly. But sorry isn't enough anymore. You have to choose to do better. As we walked out of the jail for the last time, Alexander took my hand. How do you feel? Free, I said, and realized I meant it completely. Victoria took the plea deal. 3 days later, she pled guilty to all charges and began cooperating with federal investigators. The media coverage was brutal but brief, and within a month, the scandal had faded from public attention. Alexander and I used the time to begin planning our real partnership, starting with a foundation that would coordinate and expand all of his existing social programs. But that night, as I stood in our bedroom looking out at the mountain landscape that had become my home, I thought about the phone call I'd made to my parents earlier that day. They'd finally stopped asking when I was going to come to my senses and leave Alexander. They'd finally started to understand that their disappointment of a daughter had built something they'd never imagined possible. My phone buzzed with a text message from Maria Santos, the woman I'd met at the job training center in Chicago. Saw the news about the foundation. Can't wait to see what you build next. I smiled and typed back, we're just getting started. Alexander appeared in the doorway behind me, and I turned to face the man who'd become my partner in every sense of the word. Ready for tomorrow? Tomorrow we were announcing the Hayes Foundation publicly, along with plans to open 20 new community centers across the country over the next 5 years. Tomorrow we were proving that Victoria's attempt to destroy both our lives had instead created something neither of us could have built alone. Ready, I said, and meant it completely. 6 months into our marriage, I thought I understood the Hayes family dynamics. Alexander was the brilliant, driven patriarch who'd built an empire through calculated risks and strategic thinking. Brandon was the earnest son trying to prove himself worthy of eventually inheriting that empire. And I was the unexpected addition, the social worker turned billionaire's wife who was slowly learning to navigate a world of private jets and charity galas. What I didn't understand was that Alexander had enemies. Powerful, patient enemies who'd been waiting years for an opportunity to destroy everything he'd built. And my marriage to him had just painted the biggest target imaginable on both our backs. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was in the foundation's new offices in downtown Denver, reviewing applications for our community center expansion program, when Jonathan rushed in looking more flustered than I'd ever seen him. Mrs. Hayes, we need to leave immediately, he said, already moving toward my desk to start shutting down my computer. Mr. Hayes is sending a security team to escort you to the estate. I looked up from the grant application I'd been reading, confused by the sudden urgency. What's wrong? Is Alexander okay? He's fine, but there's been a development. Federal agents raided our offices this morning with warrants for financial records going back 10 years. They're also requesting interviews with key personnel, including you. My blood turned cold. What kind of development? Jonathan's expression was grim as he helped me gather my personal items from the desk. Someone has provided the FBI with evidence alleging that Mr. Hayes has been using the foundation as a front for money laundering and tax evasion. The allegations are extensive and very detailed. That's impossible. I've seen every transaction, every program budget, every financial report. Everything is legitimate. We know that, Mrs. Hayes. But someone has gone to considerable trouble to make it appear otherwise. During the drive back to Aspen, my mind raced through possibilities. Who would have both the resources and the motivation to fabricate evidence against Alexander? Who would know enough about his business operations to create convincing-looking documentation of crimes that never happened? The answer came to me just as we pulled through the estate's security gates, and it made my stomach lurch with a combination of rage and betrayal so intense I actually felt dizzy. Victoria. Alexander was pacing in his study when I arrived, speaking rapidly into his phone in the clipped, controlled tone he used when he was furious but trying to maintain professional composure. He ended the call when he saw me and crossed the room to pull me into a tight embrace. Are you okay? He asked, his voice softer than the expression on his face. I'm fine. Jonathan told me about the raid. How bad is it? Alexander released me and moved to his desk, where several laptops were open displaying what appeared to be legal documents and financial records. Worse than I initially thought. Someone has provided federal prosecutors with fabricated evidence suggesting that we've been funneling money through the foundation to offshore accounts, paying bribes to government officials to secure favorable treatment for our business interests, and manipulating program outcomes to justify continued funding. I sank into one of the leather chairs across from his desk, my legs suddenly unsteady. Victoria. That's my assumption as well. But Chloe, this goes far beyond anything she could have orchestrated from prison. Someone with serious resources and sophisticated technical capabilities has been working on this for months, possibly years. What do you mean? Alexander turned one of the laptops toward me, and I found myself looking at bank statements that appeared to show large transfers from foundation accounts to various offshore holdings. The transactions were documented with official-looking confirmations, and were spread across dozens of different dates going back 3 years. These are incredibly sophisticated forgeries, Alexander explained. The account numbers are real, the bank letterheads are perfect, even the digital signatures match our actual banking relationships. Whoever created these has access to information that should be impossible to obtain. I studied the documents more closely, and something nagged at me. The foundation had only existed for 6 months, but these statements showed transactions going back years before it was even established. Alexander, these show transfers from 2021 and 2022, but we didn't create the foundation until last year. Exactly. Someone retrofitted our legitimate current operations onto fabricated historical records to create the appearance of long-term criminal activity. Alexander's expression was darker than I'd ever seen it. This isn't just an attack on our reputation or our business interests. This is an attempt to destroy us completely. Can we prove the documents are fake? We're working on it. Our forensic accountants are examining every transaction, and our cybersecurity team is analyzing the digital fingerprints of the fabricated documents. But Chloe, even if we can prove these are forgeries, the damage may already be done. The FBI has frozen all foundation assets pending their investigation. Every program we're funding, every community center we're building, every scholarship we're providing, it's all suspended indefinitely. I felt sick thinking about the thousands of people who depended on our programs. The job training centers would have to turn away applicants. The mental health clinics would have to reduce services. The scholarship recipients would lose their funding in the middle of the academic year. There's something else, Alexander continued. The person who provided this evidence to the FBI specifically requested that you be investigated as a co-conspirator. They're claiming that your marriage to me was part of a larger conspiracy to legitimize fraudulent charitable operations. The room seemed to tilt around me. They're saying I'm a criminal? They're saying you knowingly participated in money laundering and fraud. The narrative they've constructed suggests that your background in social work was specifically chosen to provide credibility to fake charitable programs. I stood up abruptly and began pacing, trying to process the implications. If federal prosecutors believed I was a co-conspirator, I could be looking at criminal charges. Everything I'd built with Alexander over the past 6 months, all the plans we'd made for expanding our programs, all of it could disappear overnight. Who's doing this? I asked. Victoria couldn't have orchestrated something this sophisticated from prison. No, but she could have provided information to someone who had the resources to weaponize it. Alexander pulled up another document on his laptop. I've been analyzing the timing of these alleged transactions, and they correlate almost perfectly with Victoria's visits to Brandon's apartment before her arrest. Someone has taken whatever information she gathered during her espionage activities and used it to construct this entire fabricated case against us. But who? Who has that kind of capability and motivation? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the mountain landscape. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. I've made enemies over the years, Chloe. People whose businesses I've acquired, competitors I've outmaneuvered, politicians I've refused to support. Most of them lack either the resources or the patience for something this elaborate. But there's one possibility that explains both the sophistication of the attack and the timing. Who? Richard Blackstone. I'd heard the name before but couldn't immediately place it. Alexander must have seen my confusion because he pulled up a news article on his laptop and turned the screen toward me. The headline read, Tech Mogul. Richard Blackstone loses billion-dollar government contract to Hayes Enterprises. Blackstone owns the largest data analytics company on the West Coast, Alexander explained. 3 years ago, we competed for a federal contract to develop cybersecurity infrastructure for government agencies. I won the contract, and Blackstone lost what would have been the largest deal in his company's history. I scanned the article, noting the quotes from Blackstone promising to explore all legal options to challenge what he called an unfair and potentially corrupt contract award process. You think he's been planning revenge for 3 years? I think he's been waiting for an opportunity, and Victoria's arrest provided exactly the kind of inside information he needed to construct a believable case against us. Alexander pulled up more documents. Look at this. Every fabricated transaction corresponds to a date when we had legitimate business dealings with government agencies. Someone with access to government databases could easily create the appearance of impropriety by manufacturing evidence of payments around those same time frames. But why involve me specifically? Why not just go after you? Alexander's expression became even more grim. Because attacking you attacks the foundation, and attacking the foundation is the most effective way to destroy my reputation permanently. I can survive business reversals, regulatory challenges, even criminal charges related to my corporate activities. But if the public believes I've been using charity work as a front for criminal activity, if they believe I've been stealing money intended to help vulnerable people, that's a stain that never comes off. The phone rang, interrupting our conversation. Alexander answered with a curt "Hayes" and listened intently for several minutes before hanging up. "That was our legal team," he said. "The FBI wants to interview both of us tomorrow morning. They're not arresting us yet, but they've made it clear that we're both considered persons of interest in their investigation." I sank back into the chair, overwhelmed by the speed at which our life was unraveling. 6 months ago, I'd been nobody special, a social worker living paycheck to paycheck in a tiny apartment. Now I was married to a billionaire, running a major charitable foundation, and apparently under federal investigation for crimes I'd never committed. "What do? We fight back," Alexander said with quiet determination. "But Chloe, I need you to understand something. This battle is going to get ugly. Blackstone and his allies are going to attack everything about our relationship, our marriage, your background, your motives. They're going to try to paint you as either a willing co-conspirator or a naive fool who was manipulated by a criminal husband. And which narrative do you think will be more damaging? Honestly? Either one could destroy us. If they convince people you're a criminal, the foundation loses all credibility. If they convince people you're a victim, then our marriage looks like a sham and I look like a predator who took advantage of Victoria's crimes to trick you into legitimizing my illegal activities." I studied Alexander's face, looking for any sign that he was wavering in his commitment to our partnership. What I saw instead was resolve mixed with genuine concern for my well-being. "Are you having second thoughts?" I asked. "About the marriage, about the foundation, about any of it?" Alexander crossed the room and knelt beside my chair, taking my hands in his. "Chloe, I'm terrified that I've dragged you into something that could destroy your life. But I'm not having second thoughts about you, about us, or about what we're building together. The question is whether you're prepared for what this fight is going to cost." I looked into his eyes and saw the same determination that had attracted me to this partnership in the first place. Alexander Hayes didn't back down from challenges, and he didn't abandon people who trusted him. If someone was trying to destroy us, then we were going to make them work for it. "What's our strategy?" Alexander smiled for the first time since I'd arrived home. "We do what we do best. We gather evidence, we build a case, and we systematically dismantle their attack piece by piece. And if that doesn't work, then we make sure they understand that destroying the Hayes family comes with consequences they're not prepared to face." The next morning, Alexander and I sat in a sterile conference room at the Federal Building in downtown Denver, flanked by 3 of the most expensive lawyers in Colorado. Across the table sat FBI agent Sarah Chen and federal prosecutor David Martinez, both of whom looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Agent Chen was a woman in her 40s with short black hair and the kind of intense focus that made you feel like she could see through any lie you'd ever told. Prosecutor Martinez was younger, maybe early 30s, with the eager energy of someone trying to make a name for himself on a high-profile case. "Mrs. Hayes," Agent Chen began, consulting a thick file folder, "we appreciate you agreeing to this interview. As we explained to your lawyers, you're not under arrest, but you are a person of interest in our investigation into potential fraud and money laundering activities involving the Hayes Foundation." "I understand," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Can you describe your role in the foundation's operations?" "I serve as the executive director. I oversee program development, manage relationships with service providers, review grant applications, and ensure that our funding is being used effectively to achieve our charitable goals." "And how long have you held this position?" "Since the foundation was established 6 months ago." Prosecutor Martinez leaned forward, consulting his own notes. "Mrs. Hayes, are you aware that we have bank records showing foundation assets being transferred to offshore accounts as early as 2021, 2 years before the foundation was officially established?" I glanced at our lead attorney, Patricia Wong, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod to proceed. "I'm aware that someone has provided you with fabricated documents purporting to show such transactions," I replied. "But the Hayes Foundation didn't exist in 2021, so any documents showing foundation activity from that time period are obviously fraudulent." Agent Chen's expression didn't change, but I caught a slight shift in Prosecutor Martinez's posture that suggested he hadn't expected such a direct response. "Mrs. Hayes," Agent Chen continued, "can you explain the circumstances of your marriage to Alexander Hayes?" This was the question I'd been dreading, the one that could make our entire relationship look like a criminal conspiracy depending on how I answered it. My sister Victoria was engaged to Alexander's son Brandon. At Victoria's engagement party, she drugged my champagne as part of a scheme to blackmail Alexander. Alexander had been investigating Victoria's espionage activities and was prepared for her attempt. Instead of allowing her to incapacitate me, for her own purposes, his security team ensured that I received medical attention and that Victoria faced the consequences of her actions. And the marriage? Alexander and I were married the same night, after Victoria's arrest. The circumstances were unusual, but the marriage is legal and genuine. Prosecutor Martinez exchanged a look with Agent Chen. Mrs. Hayes, don't you think it's convenient that you married someone who was under investigation by federal authorities? Mr. Alexander Hayes was not under investigation by federal authorities at the time of our marriage, our attorney interjected smoothly. The investigation began 6 months later, based on fabricated evidence provided by parties unknown. But surely, Prosecutor Martinez continued, you can understand how the timing looks suspicious. Your sister attempts to blackmail Mr. Hayes, and instead of pressing charges, he marries you. It suggests an arrangement designed to prevent you from testifying against him. I felt anger rise in my chest, but I kept my voice level. Mr. Martinez, I think you're confused about the legal implications of spousal privilege. A wife cannot be compelled to testify against her husband about communications that occurred during the marriage. But I could absolutely be compelled to testify about criminal activities I observed, and spousal privilege wouldn't protect Alexander from prosecution based on evidence I gathered independently. Agent Chen looked impressed despite herself. You seem well informed about the legal implications of marriage in criminal proceedings. I have a master's degree in social work with a focus on family systems and legal advocacy. Understanding how marriage affects legal relationships is part of my professional training. Mrs. Hayes, Agent Chen said, consulting her notes again, we have information suggesting that you were specifically recruited for your current position because your background in social work would provide credibility to fraudulent charitable operations. How do you respond to that allegation? I stared at her for a moment, genuinely confused. Agent Chen, I wasn't recruited for my current position. I created my current position. The Hayes Foundation exists because Alexander and I decided to formalize and expand charitable activities he'd been funding informally for years. If you're suggesting that I was hired to provide cover for illegal activities, then you're suggesting that I created my own job as part of a criminal conspiracy, which would make me either the stupidest criminal in history or the victim of an incredibly elaborate frame job. Prosecutor Martinez was taking notes furiously now, and I could see him beginning to realize that their narrative didn't hold together as well as they'd initially believed. Can you provide documentation of the Foundation's legitimate activities? Agent Chen asked. Absolutely. I opened the briefcase I'd brought and pulled out a thick folder of documents. Here are program reports from every community center we fund, including independent audits of their financial records. Here are academic transcripts and employment records for every scholarship recipient. Here are medical records from our healthcare clinics, with patient information redacted, showing the services we've provided. And here are testimonials from hundreds of people whose lives have been improved by our programs. I slid the folder across the table. Agent Chen, if we were running fraudulent charitable operations, where are the fake beneficiaries? Where are the inflated expenses and phantom programs? Every dollar we've spent is accounted for, and every person we've helped is real and verifiable. Agent Chen and Prosecutor Martinez spent several minutes reviewing the documents I'd provided, and I could see their confidence in their case beginning to waver. Mrs. Hayes, Agent Chen said finally, these documents appear legitimate, but that doesn't necessarily disprove the allegations against you and your husband. No, I agreed, but it does prove that the Hayes Foundation is actually doing the work it claims to be doing. Which means that whoever provided you with evidence of fraudulent activities has wasted your time with fabricated accusations. Our interview continued for another hour, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Instead of being interrogated as suspected criminals, Alexander and I were now providing information to help federal investigators understand how they'd been manipulated by false evidence. As we left the federal building, Patricia Wong pulled us aside. That went better than I expected, she said. They're clearly beginning to doubt their case, but that doesn't mean you're out of danger. Whoever orchestrated this attack isn't going to give up easily, and they may escalate their efforts when they realize their initial strategy isn't working. What do you mean by escalate? I asked. I mean they may move beyond fabricated financial evidence to more direct attacks on your reputation and credibility. Be prepared for media scrutiny, social media campaigns, and possibly even physical threats. Alexander's expression darkened. We'll increase security immediately. Good. And Alexander, I strongly recommend that you begin your own investigation into Richard Blackstone's activities. If he's behind this, then he's committed serious federal crimes, and we need evidence to prove it. That evening, Alexander and I sat in his study reviewing everything we knew about Richard Blackstone and his potential motives for attacking us. What we discovered was more disturbing than either of us had anticipated. Blackstone wasn't just a competitor who'd lost a government contract. He was a man with a history of destroying people who crossed him, using his company's data analytics capabilities to dig up damaging information about his enemies and weaponizing it through carefully orchestrated media campaigns. Look at this, Alexander said, pulling up a news article on his laptop. 3 years ago, a whistleblower at Blackstone's company reported safety violations in their government contracts. Within a month, the whistleblower was arrested on charges of tax evasion based on anonymous tips provided to the IRS. Let me guess, I said grimly. The charges were eventually dropped, but not before the whistleblower lost his job and his reputation. Exactly. And here's another one. A journalist who wrote an expose about Blackstone's business practices suddenly found himself under investigation for campaign finance violations. Again, the charges were eventually dropped, but his career was destroyed. I studied the pattern Alexander was showing me. He uses his access to data and his connections in law enforcement to manufacture scandals about people who threaten him. And he's very good at it. Which means we need to be even better at exposing what he's doing. How do we do that? Alexander smiled, and for the first time since this crisis began, he looked genuinely confident. We do what Blackstone doesn't expect. Instead of just defending ourselves, we go on the offensive. We investigate him the same way he's been investigating us, and we make sure the world understands exactly what kind of man Richard Blackstone really is. And if he escalates in response? Then we make sure he understands that the Hayes family doesn't just defend itself. We fight back. As I looked at my husband's determined expression, I realized that the woman who'd woken up married to a stranger 6 months ago was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that sometimes the only way to protect the people you love and the work you believe in is to destroy the people trying to destroy you. Richard Blackstone had picked the wrong family to target. And by the time we were done with him, he was going to understand exactly what that mistake was going to cost him. 3 weeks after our FBI interview, I was sitting in the Foundation's temporary offices when Tyler Brooks burst through the door holding a laptop like it contained nuclear secrets. Tyler was our head of cybersecurity, a brilliant former NSA analyst who joined our team specifically to help investigate the fabricated evidence against us. Chloe, you need to see this immediately, Tyler said, setting the laptop on my desk and pulling up what appeared to be a complex network diagram. I've been tracking the digital fingerprints of those fake bank statements, and I found something that's going to blow this case wide open. I leaned forward, studying the screen. The diagram showed connections between various computer servers, IP addresses, and what looked like timestamps stretching back over 2 years. What am I looking at? Evidence that Richard Blackstone didn't just fabricate documents about you and Alexander. He's been doing this to dozens of people for years. Tyler's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up file after file of what appeared to be similar fabricated financial records. Tax evasion charges against a city councilman who opposed one of Blackstone's development projects. Fraud allegations against a tech startup that was competing for the same investors. Embezzlement accusations against a nonprofit director who criticized Blackstone's environmental record. I felt my pulse quicken as I understood the implications. You're saying this is a pattern? I'm saying this is a systematic operation. Blackstone has been using his company's data analytics capabilities and his connections in law enforcement to destroy anyone who threatens his business interests. Tyler pulled up another screen showing financial transfers. And look at this. Every single case was preceded by payments from Blackstone's company to a consulting firm called Strategic Intelligence Solutions. What's Strategic Intelligence Solutions? Officially, they're a business consulting and research firm. Unofficially, they're a private intelligence operation that specializes in opposition research and reputation management. Tyler's expression was grim. Basically, they're professional character assassins. I stared at the evidence Tyler had uncovered, my mind racing through the implications. If we could prove that Blackstone had been systematically targeting his enemies with fabricated evidence, it wouldn't just clear our names. It would expose a criminal conspiracy that had been operating for years. Tyler, this is incredible work. But how do we prove it in court? How do we connect Strategic Intelligence Solutions directly to the fabricated evidence against us? Tyler smiled, the expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly that question. Because I found the smoking gun. The metadata on the fake bank statements shows they were created using the same software suite and formatting templates that Strategic Intelligence Solutions used for all their other fabrication jobs. Same digital signatures, same file compression algorithms, even the same spelling error in the bank letterhead. Spelling error? They consistently misspell transferred as transferred in all their fake documents. It's like a signature they don't even realize they're leaving behind. I felt a surge of excitement mixed with vindication. After weeks of feeling like we were fighting shadows, we finally had concrete evidence of the conspiracy against us. We need to get this to our lawyers immediately, I said, reaching for my phone to call Patricia Wong. Already done, Tyler replied. But Chloe, there's something else. Something that changes everything about this case. What do you mean? Tyler pulled up another file, this one showing communication logs and meeting schedules. Strategic Intelligence Solutions has been in contact with someone inside the federal prosecutor's office. Someone who's been feeding them information about the investigation and coordinating the timing of evidence releases. My blood turned cold. You're saying someone in the prosecutor's office is working with Blackstone? I'm saying someone in David Martinez's office has been receiving payments from Strategic Intelligence Solutions for the past 6 months, dating back to before the investigation into you and Alexander even began. The room seemed to spin around me as I processed what Tyler was telling me. The federal prosecutor who'd been building a case against us was potentially corrupt, working with the same people who'd fabricated the evidence in the first place. Who is it? I can't tell from the financial records alone. The payments are going to a shell company, and the communication logs don't include names, just phone numbers and meeting locations. But whoever it is has been providing strategic intelligence solutions with detailed information about federal investigation procedures and helping them time their evidence releases for maximum impact. I sank back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy we were facing. This wasn't just about Richard Blackstone trying to destroy a business rival. This was about corruption at the highest levels of law enforcement, about people who were supposed to protect justice instead selling it to the highest bidder. Tyler, we need to be very careful about how we handle this information. If there's a corrupt prosecutor involved, then going through normal legal channels could tip them off and give them time to destroy evidence. Already thought of that, Tyler said. I've made copies of everything and stored them in multiple secure locations. And I've been in contact with a journalist named Rebecca Foster who specializes in investigating government corruption. She's agreed to meet with us, but only if we can provide additional corroborating evidence. What kind of evidence? The kind that proves David Martinez knew the evidence against you was fabricated before he decided to pursue the case anyway. That afternoon, Alexander and I met with Patricia Wong in her downtown Denver office to review Tyler's findings. Patricia was a woman in her 60s who'd built her reputation defending high-profile clients against federal prosecution, and her expression as she reviewed Tyler's evidence was darker than I'd ever seen it. This is extraordinary, Patricia said, setting down the printed documents Tyler had provided. If even half of this is accurate, we're not just dealing with a civil lawsuit. We're looking at federal racketeering charges, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and potentially treason depending on what government contracts Blackstone interfered with. What's our next move? Alexander asked. Carefully, Patricia replied. If David Martinez is corrupt, then filing motions in his court could alert him to what we've discovered and give him time to cover his tracks. We need to take this directly to the U.S. Attorney's Office and request that Martinez be recused from the case. And if the U.S. Attorney won't listen? Then we go to the press and let public pressure force their hand. Patricia's expression was steely. But Alexander, I need you to understand something. Once we make these allegations public, there's no going back. Blackstone and his allies are going to come after you with everything they have, and they're not going to care about collateral damage. What do you mean by collateral damage? I mean they're going to attack Chloe personally. Her background, her marriage to you, her competence to run the foundation. They're going to try to paint her as either a criminal conspirator or a naive victim, and either narrative serves their purposes. I felt Alexander's hand find mine under the table, a gesture of support that had become second nature over the months of our partnership. I can handle whatever they throw at me, I said. But what about the foundation? What about the programs we're funding? That's the real target, Patricia said grimly. Destroying the foundation isn't just about hurting you and Alexander financially. It's about proving that Blackstone can destroy anyone who crosses him, no matter how powerful or well-connected they are. Then we don't let him destroy it, Alexander said with quiet determination. We expose him first. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from Rebecca Foster in a small coffee shop in Boulder, far enough from Denver to avoid any surveillance. Blackstone might have arranged. Rebecca was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of intense focus that came from years of investigating people who didn't want to be investigated. Mrs. Hayes, Rebecca said, reviewing the documents I'd brought, this is some of the most comprehensive evidence of systematic corruption I've seen in 20 years of investigative journalism. But I need you to understand what you're asking me to do. I'm asking you to expose the truth about Richard Blackstone and the people working with him. You're asking me to take on one of the most powerful men in Colorado, a federal prosecutor, and a private intelligence operation that has connections throughout law enforcement and politics. Rebecca leaned forward, her expression serious. People who cross Richard Blackstone have a tendency to find themselves under criminal investigation. Journalists who write unflattering stories about him suddenly face libel lawsuits and IRS audits. Are you saying you won't pursue the story? I'm saying I need more than documents and digital evidence. I need sources, people willing to go on the record about what Blackstone and his associates have been doing. What kind of sources? Rebecca pulled out a notebook and began writing. Employees at Strategic Intelligence Solutions who can testify about their fabrication operations. Victims of Blackstone's previous attacks who are willing to share their stories. And most importantly, someone inside the federal prosecutor's office who can confirm that David Martinez knew the evidence against you was fake. How do we find people like that? Very carefully. And with the understanding that approaching potential sources puts both them and us at risk. I spent the next week reaching out to people who might be willing to help expose Blackstone's operation. The process was more challenging and dangerous than I'd anticipated. Former employees of Strategic Intelligence Solutions either refused to talk or claimed they'd never heard of the company. Victims of Blackstone's previous attacks were terrified of speaking publicly, convinced that any statement they made would result in renewed persecution. But slowly, carefully, we began to build a network of sources willing to corroborate Tyler's digital evidence with personal testimony. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, the woman I'd met at our job training center in Chicago, called me on a Thursday evening with information that changed everything about our case. Chloe, I need to tell you something. About my background, Maria said, her voice tight with nervous energy. I didn't just graduate from your coding program. Before I went to prison, I worked for Strategic Intelligence Solutions. I nearly dropped my phone. Maria, what are you talking about? I was a data analyst for SIS for 3 years before I was arrested on drug charges. The arrest was legitimate, my addiction was real, but what I didn't realize until recently was that my work at SIS was helping them destroy people's lives. What kind of work? Document fabrication, financial record manipulation, digital identity theft. I thought I was doing legitimate background research for corporate clients. It wasn't until I saw the news coverage of your case that I recognized the pattern of fabricated evidence. I felt my heart racing as I understood the implications of what Maria was telling me. Maria, are you saying you have first-hand knowledge of how SIS operates? I'm saying I helped create some of the tools they're using to fabricate evidence against you. And I still have copies of the software and the training materials they gave me. Are you willing to testify about this? There was a long pause before Maria answered. Chloe, testifying against SIS could put me back in prison. They'll claim I'm lying to get revenge for some imagined wrong, and they have the resources to make any charges stick. But it could also save the foundation and help expose a criminal conspiracy that's been destroying innocent people for years. I know. That's why I'm calling. Your foundation gave me a second chance when no one else would. If speaking out helps protect the programs that are helping other people like me, then I'll do it. Maria, I can't ask you to put yourself at risk for us. You're not asking. I'm offering. But Chloe, if I do this, I need to know that you and Alexander are committed to seeing this through to the end. Because once I go public with what I know, there's no going back for any of us. I thought about everything we'd built over the past year, all the lives we'd changed through the Foundation's programs, all the people who were counting on us to continue fighting for them. We're committed, I said. Whatever it takes. The next morning, Alexander and I met with Rebecca Foster and Maria Santos in Patricia Wong's office to plan our media strategy. The goal was to release the story about Blackstone's criminal conspiracy in a way that would force federal authorities to act while protecting our sources from retaliation. We need to coordinate this carefully, Rebecca said, reviewing her notes. I'll publish the initial investigation showing the pattern of fabricated evidence and the connections to Strategic Intelligence Solutions. Simultaneously, Patricia will file motions requesting that all charges against Alexander and Chloe be dismissed and that David Martinez be recused from any future proceedings. What about protecting Maria? I asked. I'll make sure she's portrayed As a whistleblower who's helping expose corruption, not as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge, Rebecca replied. And Patricia will file for whistleblower protection under federal law. The timing is crucial, Patricia added. Once this story breaks, Blackstone and his associates are going to scramble to destroy evidence and discredit our sources. We need to be prepared for an immediate counterattack. What kind of counterattack? Character assassination, legal harassment, possibly even physical threats, Patricia said grimly. Richard Blackstone didn't build his empire by playing fair. And he's not going to start now. That evening, as Rebecca worked on finalizing her article and Patricia prepared the legal motions, I sat with Alexander in our study discussing the potential consequences of going public with our allegations. Are you having second thoughts? Alexander asked, studying my face in the lamplight. About exposing Blackstone? No. About what this is going to cost us personally? Yes. What do you mean? I gestured around the study, at the books and artwork and comfortable furniture that had become the backdrop of our life together. This whole thing started because Victoria tried to manipulate her way into your family's wealth. Now we're risking everything we've built to fight a man who's trying to destroy us for reasons that have nothing to do with us personally. Chloe, this stopped being about us personally the moment we discovered that Blackstone has been destroying innocent people. For years. If we don't stop him, who will? But what if we can't stop him? What if he's too powerful, too well-connected, too ruthless for us to defeat? Alexander stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountain landscape that had become our sanctuary. Do you remember what you told me when we first started talking about the foundation? You said that the difference between having wealth and being worth something was what you chose to do with the resources available to you. I remember. This is what we choose to do with our resources. We use our wealth, our connections, our platform to expose corruption and protect people who can't protect themselves. Alexander turned back to face me. Even if it costs us everything. I studied my husband's determined expression and realized that the man I'd married as part of a desperate scheme to stop Victoria had become someone I genuinely admired and respected. Not because of his wealth or his power, but because of his willingness to risk both in service of something larger than himself. Okay, I said. Let's destroy Richard Blackstone. Rebecca's article was published online at exactly 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, timed to coincide with the filing of Patricia's legal motions and the release of Tyler's digital evidence to federal authorities. The headline read, Billionaire tech mogul accused of systematic fraud and corruption in federal investigation scheme. The story was devastating in its detail and precision. Rebecca had documented not just Blackstone's attacks on Alexander and me, but his entire pattern of destroying enemies through fabricated evidence and corrupt law enforcement connections. She'd interviewed 5 previous victims who'd finally agreed to go on the record, and she'd obtained internal documents from strategic intelligence solutions that proved their role in creating false evidence. But the most damaging revelation was buried halfway through the article. Rebecca had discovered that David Martinez, the federal prosecutor pursuing our case, had received over $200,000 in payments from shell companies connected to Richard Blackstone over the past 2 years. By 10 a.m., the story had been picked up by every major news outlet in the country. By noon, protesters were gathering outside Blackstone's corporate headquarters demanding his arrest. By evening, federal authorities had announced that David Martinez was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into the corruption allegations. Alexander and I watched the coverage from our study, surrounded by our lawyers and security team. For the first time in months, I felt like we were winning. That feeling lasted exactly 6 hours. At 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of Alexander's phone ringing insistently. He answered with a groggy haze that quickly sharpened into full alertness. As he listened to whoever was calling. What is it? I asked as he hung up. Alexander's expression was darker than I'd ever seen it. Rebecca Foster was arrested an hour ago on charges of receiving stolen government documents. Maria Santos was arrested at the same time on charges of violating the terms of her parole. And Patricia Wong's law office was raided by federal agents, claiming to investigate potential attorney-client privilege violations. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. They're destroying everyone who helped us. It's worse than that, Alexander said, reaching for his laptop. Look at this. He pulled up a news website showing a breaking story with the headline, Hayes Foundation Director Admits to Fabricating Corruption Allegations Against Innocent Businessman. The article quoted an anonymous source within the foundation claiming that I had orchestrated the entire attack on Richard Blackstone as revenge for his legitimate investigation into our fraudulent charitable operations. It included excerpts from what appeared to be emails I'd never written and recorded phone conversations I'd never had. They're not just destroying our allies, I said, my voice barely a whisper. They're rewriting the entire story. Alexander pulled me close, and I could feel the tension in his body as he processed the scope of the counterattack we were facing. Chloe, we knew this was going to get ugly. But I need you to know that no matter what happens next, no matter what lies they tell about us, I believe in what we're doing. I believe in you. I looked at my husband, this man who'd become my partner in every sense of the word, and realized that Richard Blackstone had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that destroying our allies and fabricating new evidence against us would break our resolve. Instead, he'd just proven that everything we'd alleged about him was true. And now we were going to make him pay for underestimating us. Alexander, how much liquid cash can we access immediately? Why? Because if Blackstone wants to play dirty, then it's time he learned that the Hayes family has resources he hasn't even imagined yet. And we're about to use every single one of them to destroy him. The war room Alexander assembled in the basement of our Aspen estate looked like something out of a spy thriller. 6 computer workstations hummed with activity, manned by the best cybersecurity experts money could hire. Former federal agents worked alongside investigative journalists and forensic accountants, all united by a single purpose: dismantling Richard Blackstone's empire before he could destroy us completely. I stood at the center of it all, no longer the naive social worker who'd stumbled into this world of billionaire politics and corporate warfare. Over the past year, I'd learned to speak the language of power, to think strategically about resources and leverage, to understand that sometimes the only way to protect innocent people was to ruthlessly destroy those who preyed on them. Status report, I said, addressing the room with the kind of authority I'd never imagined possessing. Tyler looked up from his bank of computer monitors. We've confirmed that Strategic Intelligence Solutions has been operating fabrication labs in 7 cities across the country. They're not just targeting business rivals anymore. They've been creating false evidence for divorce proceedings, custody battles, even criminal cases where their clients wanted specific outcomes. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic accountant we'd hired from New York, raised her hand. Ivetrest. Payments from Blackstone's companies to over 40 different judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials across 12 states. We're not just looking at corruption here. We're looking at the systematic purchase of the American justice system. Marcus Thompson, a former FBI agent who'd quit the bureau in disgust over political interference, stood up from his workstation. I've been in contact with agents inside the Denver field office. The raid on Patricia Wong's office was ordered directly by someone in Washington, bypassing normal protocols. They're trying to bury our evidence before anyone in legitimate law enforcement can review it. I felt a familiar surge of anger mixed with determination. For every move we made to expose the truth, Blackstone's network seemed to have a countermove ready. But what they didn't understand was that every action they took to silence us only provided more evidence of their guilt. What about our media strategy? I asked. Rebecca Foster, who'd been released on bail after 18 hours in federal custody, looked up from her laptop. I've been in contact with journalists at the Washington Post, New York Times, and CNN. They're all interested in the story, but they're waiting for more corroborating evidence. Blackstone's people have been calling their editors, threatening lawsuits if they publish anything based on our allegations. Then we give them evidence they can't ignore, Alexander said, joining the conversation. He'd been on phone calls for the past 3 hours, reaching out to business contacts and political allies who owed him favors. I've arranged meetings with the attorneys general of Colorado, California, and New York. All 3 states have active investigations into companies that have done business with Strategic Intelligence Solutions. What about the federal level? I asked. That's more complicated. Blackstone has friends in Washington, and David Martinez's corruption has tainted the entire case against us. But I've been in contact with Senator Patricia Williams. She chairs the Senate Judiciary Committee, and she's agreed to hold emergency hearings if we can provide compelling evidence of systematic judicial corruption. I studied the faces around the room, these people who'd risked their careers and their freedom to help us expose the truth. Some of them were motivated by money, others by principle, but all of them understood that what we were fighting for went beyond our personal grievances against Richard Blackstone. There's something else, Tyler said, his voice tense with excitement. I've been monitoring communications from Strategic Intelligence Solutions, and they're planning something big. There's going to be a meeting tomorrow night at Blackstone's private estate in Vail. All the major players will be there, including several federal prosecutors and at least 3 judges. Marcus leaned forward. What kind of meeting? From what I can tell, they're coordinating a final push to destroy us permanently. Blackstone is convinced that if he can get Alexander and Chloe arrested on federal charges, everything else will disappear. They're planning to present fabricated evidence that's so compelling and comprehensive that no one will question its authenticity. I felt my blood chill as I understood the implications. They're not just trying to destroy our reputation anymore. They're trying to put us in prison. For how long? Alexander asked. Tyler's expression was grim. Based on the charges they're preparing, 25 to 30 years. They're going to claim that the Hayes Foundation was a front for money laundering billions of dollars in international drug money, that you've been bribing government officials to cover up environmental crimes committed by your companies, and that Chloe has been using her social work background to identify vulnerable children for a human trafficking operation. The room fell silent as everyone processed the scope of the accusations Blackstone was preparing to level against us. These weren't just character assassination attempts. These were allegations so serious and so horrific that even being charged would destroy us permanently, regardless of whether we were eventually acquitted. How much time do we have? I asked. They're planning to present their evidence to a grand jury on Friday morning, Tyler replied. That gives us exactly 4 days to prove our innocence and expose their guilt. Then we use those 4 days to destroy them first, I said with quiet determination. Tyler, I need you to get me everything you can about that meeting tomorrow night. Guest list, agenda, security arrangements, everything. Chloe, what are you thinking? Alexander asked, though I could see in his expression that he already suspected what I was planning. I'm thinking that if Blackstone wants to coordinate his final attack against us in person, then we should be there to record every word of it. The plan we developed over the next 24 hours was audacious to the point of being insane. Blackstone's estate in Vale was a fortress, surrounded by private security and electronic surveillance systems that would detect any conventional attempt at infiltration. But it had one weakness that our research had revealed. Richard Blackstone was obsessively proud of his wine collection, and he'd hired Elena Vasquez, one of the world's most respected sommeliers, to curate a special tasting for his guests. Elena, as it turned out, had a daughter who'd been one of the first scholarship recipients from our foundation. When Rebecca Foster approached her with evidence of what Blackstone had been doing to destroy charitable organizations, Elena had agreed to help us in any way she could. The tasting will begin at 8 p.m. in Blackstone's private wine cellar, Elena explained during our clandestine meeting at a restaurant in Denver. I'll be serving wines and providing commentary throughout the evening. The acoustics in the cellar are perfect, and there are multiple alcoves where recording equipment could be hidden without being detected. What about security? Marcus asked. The wine cellar is considered a low-risk area since it's underground and accessible only through the main house. Security will be focused on the perimeter and the main social areas. Once the tasting begins, I'll be the only staff member in the cellar with the guests. How many guests are we talking about? I asked. 12 confirmed attendees, including Blackstone, 3 federal prosecutors, 2 federal judges, the Director of Strategic Intelligence Solutions, and several of Blackstone's business associates. I felt a surge of excitement mixed with terror. If we could record those 12 people discussing their conspiracy to fabricate evidence and corrupt federal prosecutors, we'd have enough material to bring down not just Blackstone but his entire network. Elena, I can't ask you to risk your career and potentially your freedom for us, I said. Elena's expression was steely. Mrs. Hayes, my daughter was living on the streets before your scholarship program gave her a chance at college. She's now a pre-med student at Stanford because of the opportunities your foundation provided. If I can help protect those opportunities for other children, then the risk is worth it. The next evening, I found myself crouched in the back of a catering van, wearing a server's uniform and carrying recording equipment that Tyler assured me was undetectable by conventional security sweeps. Alexander had wanted to infiltrate the meeting himself, but we'd decided that my smaller size and less recognizable face made me the better choice for what was essentially a breaking and entering operation. Elena had arranged for me to be listed as her assistant for the evening, and the false identity documents our team had prepared were good enough to pass casual inspection. As we drove through the gates of Blackstone's estate, I reminded myself that everything we'd built together depended on the next few hours. The wine cellar was even more impressive than Elena had described. Carved into the natural rock beneath Blackstone's mansion, it featured temperature-controlled alcoves housing thousands of bottles worth millions of dollars. The main tasting area was furnished with leather chairs arranged around a massive oak table, with mood lighting that created an atmosphere of intimate conspiracy. I spent the hour before the guests arrived planting micro-recording devices in strategic locations throughout the cellar. The equipment was so small and sophisticated that even if someone knew to look for it, they'd have trouble finding it. By the time Blackstone and his associates descended the stone stairs, I was positioned in a service alcove where I could observe the entire proceedings while remaining invisible. Blackstone entered first, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of casual arrogance that came from decades of never facing consequences for his actions. He was followed by David Martinez, the federal prosecutor whose corruption we'd already exposed, and two men I recognized from Tyler's research as federal judges who'd been receiving payments from Blackstone's companies. The director of Strategic Intelligence Solutions was a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, a former CIA analyst who'd parlayed her intelligence background into a lucrative career fabricating evidence for wealthy clients. The remaining attendees were business associates and politicians whose careers had been built on the foundation of Blackstone's money and influence. "Gentlemen, ladies," Blackstone began, raising a glass of wine that probably cost more than most people's annual salary, "tonight we finalize the destruction of Alexander Hayes and his naive little wife. By Friday morning, they'll be in federal custody, and their pathetic foundation will be permanently disbanded." Dr. Chen opened a briefcase and began distributing documents to the assembled guests. "The evidence package we've prepared is our most sophisticated work yet. Financial records showing that Hayes Foundation money was used to purchase weapons for South American drug cartels. Communication logs proving that Chloe Hayes has been identifying vulnerable children through her social work contacts and selling them to human trafficking networks. Video testimony from alleged victims describing years of abuse." My stomach turned as I realized the scope of the horror they were planning to unleash. These weren't just accusations of financial impropriety. These were allegations so monstrous that even being charged would destroy us permanently, regardless of our eventual innocence. Judge Robert Kim, a federal judge in Colorado whose yacht and vacation home had been purchased with Blackstone's money, leaned forward with interest. "How confident are we that this evidence will pass scrutiny?" "Completely confident," Dr. Chen replied. "We've learned from our previous mistakes. The digital forensics are flawless, the documentation is comprehensive, and we've prepared witness testimony that will be impossible to refute." "What about the journalists and investigators who've been supporting Hayes?" asked Martinez. "Already handled," Blackstone said with a cold smile. "Rebecca Foster will be arrested tomorrow morning on new charges of conspiring with foreign agents to undermine U.S. national security. Maria Santos will be found in violation of her parole and returned to prison indefinitely. Dr. Jennifer Walsh will discover that her forensic accounting firm is under investigation for tax evasion and money laundering. And if Hayes tries to fight back," asked Judge Patricia Stone, a federal appeals court judge whose gambling debts had been quietly paid off by Blackstone's associates. "He won't have the resources," Blackstone replied. "Once he's arrested, we'll freeze all his assets under terrorism and human trafficking statutes. His lawyers will be under investigation, his business associates will distance themselves, and his wife will be too busy trying to avoid a death sentence to mount any kind of defense." I pressed myself further back into the shadows, my hands shaking as I operated the recording equipment that was capturing every word of their conspiracy. These people weren't just planning to frame us for crimes we didn't commit. They were planning to destroy everyone who'd tried to help us, to dismantle the foundation that was helping thousands of people, to corrupt the justice system so thoroughly that truth itself became irrelevant. "There is one potential complication," Dr. Chen said, consulting her notes. "Tyler Brooks, their cybersecurity expert, has been remarkably effective at uncovering our previous operations. His digital forensics capabilities pose a genuine threat to our fabricated evidence." "Then we eliminate him as a threat," Blackstone said matter-of-factly. "Car accident, drug overdose, something that looks natural but removes him from the equation permanently." Judge Kim shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Richard, we agreed that violence was off the table. Fabricating evidence is one thing, but murder is a line we can't cross." Blackstone's expression turned predatory. "Robert, you've been taking my money for 8 years. Your children's college educations were paid for with my money. Your wife's medical treatments were funded with my money. Don't develop a conscience now." "I'm not developing a conscience," Judge Kim replied, his voice tight with stress. "I'm trying to avoid spending the rest of my life in prison. If Tyler Brooks dies under suspicious circumstances right before he's supposed to testify against us, it's going to look exactly like what it is. Then we make sure it doesn't look suspicious," Dr. Chen interjected. "Strategic Intelligence Solutions has relationships with people who specialize in making problems disappear without leaving evidence behind." I felt bile rise in my throat, as I realized they weren't just talking about framing us for crimes. They were casually discussing murdering anyone who posed a threat to their operation. Tyler, Rebecca, Maria, possibly even Alexander and me if we became too much trouble to handle through legal channels. Martinez raised his hand. "What about the Senate hearings?" "Patricia Williams is still pushing for a Judiciary Committee investigation. Senator Williams will discover that her own campaign finances are under federal investigation," Blackstone replied. "Amazing how quickly politicians lose interest in fighting corruption when they're facing corruption charges themselves. You have fabricated evidence against a sitting U.S. senator? Judge Stone asked, her voice betraying genuine shock. I have fabricated evidence against anyone who might pose a threat to our operation, Blackstone said calmly. Senators, governors, Supreme Court justices. Power in America isn't about what's true, it's about what can be proven, and I control what gets proven. Dr. Chen stood and began pacing around the wine cellar. The Hayes operation has taught us valuable lessons about scalability. We've proven that we can destroy anyone, regardless of their wealth or connections, if we're systematic about it. Moving forward, Strategic Intelligence Solutions will be expanding our operations to include international targets. What do you mean? Martinez asked. Foreign business leaders who compete with American companies, international human rights. Activists who interfere with profitable operations, journalists who investigate inconvenient truths. The techniques we've developed for domestic targets work just as well internationally, and foreign governments are often even more corrupt and cooperative than American officials. I realized I was witnessing something far more significant than a conspiracy to frame Alexander and me. I was recording evidence of a systematic operation to corrupt judicial systems and destroy anyone who threatened the interests of wealthy clients. This wasn't just about revenge against a business rival. This was about the wholesale purchase of justice itself. The timeline for the Hayes operation is as follows, Blackstone said, consulting his phone. Tomorrow morning, new evidence will be presented to the grand jury. By noon, arrest warrants will be issued. By evening, Alexander and Chloe Hayes will be in federal custody facing charges that carry potential death sentences. And if they try to present counter-evidence? Judge Kim asked. They won't have the opportunity, Martinez replied. I've arranged for their lawyers to be arrested on obstruction of justice charges the moment Hayes and his wife are taken into custody. By the time they can arrange new legal representation, the narrative will be so firmly established that no amount of counter-evidence will matter. Dr. Chen smiled, the expression of someone who took genuine pleasure in destroying lives. The beauty of this operation is its completeness. We're not just destroying the Hayes family, we're destroying the very idea that wealthy, powerful people can be held accountable for their actions. After this, anyone who thinks about challenging our clients will remember what happened to Alexander Hayes and think twice. Blackstone raised his wine glass again. To the permanent establishment of order over chaos, profit over principle, and power over truth. The assembled guests raised their glasses in a toast that made my skin crawl. I watched these people. These judges and prosecutors and intelligence operatives who were supposed to protect justice, celebrate their plan to corrupt it beyond recognition. But as I crouched in that wine cellar, recording every word of their conspiracy, I realized something that none of them understood. They'd made a crucial mistake by gathering in one place to coordinate their final attack against us. They provided me with exactly the evidence we needed to destroy not just Richard Blackstone, but his entire network of corruption. I stayed hidden until the last guest had left the wine cellar, then spent another hour retrieving the recording equipment I'd planted throughout the room. By the time Elena and I made our way back to the catering van, I was carrying documentation of the most comprehensive criminal conspiracy in modern American history. The drive back to Denver felt surreal. In my hands were recordings that would destroy dozens of powerful people and expose a level of corruption that most Americans couldn't imagine. But I also knew that we had less than 12 hours before Blackstone's plan went into effect and Alexander and I found ourselves under arrest for crimes we'd never committed. Alexander was waiting for me when I arrived at the estate, along with our entire team of investigators and lawyers. I plugged the recording devices into Tyler's computer system and watched as their faces changed from hope to shock to fury as they heard Blackstone and his associates discuss their conspiracy. This is incredible, Rebecca said, her voice barely a whisper. This isn't just evidence of corruption, it's a confession to systematic subversion of the American justice system. How quickly can we get this to legitimate authorities? I asked. Marcus Thompson was already reaching for his phone. I have contacts in the FBI's Public Corruption Unit who've been investigating similar cases. They can have federal marshals making arrests within hours. What about the media? Alexander asked. I'm sending copies to every major news outlet. Simultaneously, Rebecca replied. By morning, this will be the biggest story in the country. Tyler looked up from his computer, where he'd been analyzing the recordings. There's something else. The audio quality is so good that we can use voice recognition software to verify the identities of everyone who spoke. Even if they claim the recordings are fabricated, we can prove scientifically that these are their actual voices. Patricia Wong, who'd been silent throughout the playback, finally spoke. This changes everything. Not just for your case, but for hundreds of cases these people have been involved in. Every conviction, every sentence, every legal decision they've influenced will need to be reviewed. I looked around the room at the faces of people who'd risked everything to help us expose the truth. So what happens now? Now we watch Richard Blackstone's empire burn, Alexander said with quiet satisfaction. The arrests began at dawn. Federal marshals simultaneously raided locations across 7 states, taking into custody judges, prosecutors, business leaders, and intelligence operatives who'd been part of Blackstone's conspiracy. The recordings I'd made provided not just evidence of their planned frame job against us, but documentation of dozens of previous operations where they'd fabricated evidence to destroy innocent people. Richard Blackstone himself was arrested at his Denver office, led away in handcuffs while news cameras captured his perp walk for posterity. Dr. Sarah Chen and the entire leadership of Strategic Intelligence Solutions were arrested at their headquarters, along with computers and files documenting years of criminal operations. David Martinez was arrested in his office at the federal courthouse, charged with corruption, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The 2 federal judges who'd been taking Blackstone's money were arrested at their homes, their judicial careers ending in the most public disgrace possible. But it was the media coverage that truly destroyed them. Rebecca's article, published simultaneously by dozens of news outlets and accompanied by audio excerpts from my recordings, exposed not just the conspiracy against us but the systematic corruption of American justice. The headline read, "The Price of Justice: How Billionaire Richard Blackstone Bought Federal Judges and Prosecutors to Destroy His Enemies." Within hours, protesters were gathering outside federal courthouses demanding the resignation of any judge or prosecutor who'd ever taken money from Blackstone's network. Politicians who'd been preparing to attack us suddenly found themselves scrambling to distance themselves from the corruption scandal that was consuming Washington. Senator Patricia Williams used her Judiciary Committee chairmanship to announce emergency hearings that would examine not just Blackstone's operations, but the broader question of how money had corrupted the federal justice system. "What we've learned from the Hayes case," she said in a televised statement, "is that our entire legal system has been compromised by people who believe justice can be bought and sold like any other commodity." Alexander and I watched the coverage from our study, surrounded by the same team of investigators and lawyers who'd helped us expose the truth. For the first time in months, I felt like we could breathe freely. "How many people do you think we've saved?" I asked, thinking about all the future victims who would never face Blackstone's fabricated evidence. "Thousands," Tyler replied. "Maybe tens of thousands, if you count all the cases that will be overturned and all the future crimes that have been prevented." Patricia Wong was reviewing legal documents on her laptop. The federal prosecutors handling Blackstone's case estimate that his network was responsible for over 500 fabricated criminal cases over the past decade. That's 500 innocent people who were destroyed by a system that was supposed to protect them. "What about Victoria?" I asked. "Is this going to affect her case?" "Actually, yes," Patricia replied. "Since her prosecution was handled by David Martinez, and we now know Martinez was corrupt, her conviction will probably be overturned. She'll likely be released and given the opportunity for a new trial with legitimate prosecutors." I thought about my sister, sitting in her prison cell, probably watching the news coverage of Blackstone's arrest and realizing that her small-time scheming had inadvertently exposed the largest corruption scandal in modern American history. "Do you think she'll try to contact us?" Alexander asked. "Probably. But it doesn't matter. Victoria made her choices, and she'll have to live with the consequences. Our focus needs to be on rebuilding the foundation and helping the people who've been hurt by Blackstone's operations." Over the next several weeks, the full scope of Blackstone's criminal network became clear. Federal investigators discovered evidence of systematic corruption involving over 200 judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials across 30 states. Strategic Intelligence Solutions had fabricated evidence in criminal cases, civil lawsuits, divorce proceedings, custody battles, and business disputes, destroying thousands of lives in pursuit of profit. The Hayes Foundation was cleared of all allegations and our frozen assets were released with formal apologies from federal authorities. We used the experience to establish new programs focused on helping victims of judicial corruption and supporting organizations that work to expose government misconduct. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months later, when Richard Blackstone was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in shackles, he turned to look at Alexander and me sitting in the courtroom gallery. The man who'd tried to destroy us with fabricated evidence was finally facing justice for his real crimes. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked me that evening as we sat in our study, looking out at the mountain landscape that had become our sanctuary. Getting married to a stranger, getting dragged into a world of billionaire politics and criminal conspiracies? I thought about the question seriously, considering everything we'd been through together. The fear, the danger, the constant threat of imprisonment or death. But I also thought about the thousands of people whose lives had been improved by our foundation's programs, the corrupt officials who were now in prison instead of destroying innocent people, the systemic changes that were being implemented to prevent future corruption. No, I said finally. I don't regret any of it. Victoria tried to drug me and manipulate me to further her own schemes. Instead, she accidentally connected me with someone who helped me become the person I was always meant to be. Alexander smiled, the same genuine expression I'd learned to recognize over our months of partnership and love. So what's next for us? We keep building, I said, taking his hand. We use everything we've learned to create something that Blackstone and people like him can never destroy. We make sure that what happened to us can never happen to anyone else. And if someone tries to stop us? I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, the quiet social worker who'd let people walk over her because she didn't know how to fight back. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to ruthlessly destroy those who preyed on them. Then we destroy them first, I said with quiet determination. 6 months later, Victoria was indeed released from prison when her conviction was overturned due to prosecutorial misconduct. She sent me a letter apologizing for everything she'd done and asking if we could rebuild our relationship. I never replied. Some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. But I did use her story, along with our own, as the foundation for a new program that helped families torn apart by criminal conspiracies and judicial corruption. Because in the end, the best revenge against people who try to destroy you isn't just surviving their attacks. It's using their attempts to destroy you as the foundation for something that helps other people survive similar attacks. The Hayes Foundation now operates in all 50 states, helping thousands of people every year. Alexander and I have built something that neither of us could have created alone, a partnership based on shared values and mutual respect that has grown into genuine love and admiration. And every morning when I wake up in our home in the mountains, I remember the scared woman who woke up in a strange bed wearing a wedding dress she didn't recognize, married to a man she barely knew. That woman was terrified of the future and convinced she had no power to shape her own destiny. I'm grateful every day that she was wrong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.